She ran barefoot through the desert with a carved symbol bleeding on her forehead, and her father's cult hunting her pregnant body for sacrifice. But what she found in that lonely cabin would change everything she believed about prophecy, protection, and the power of love over fear. Welcome to a tale that will grip your heart for the next 2 hours. This is the story of Eleanor Winters, a woman who discovered that sometimes salvation comes not from the heavens, but from the most unexpected places on earth. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The Utah sun was merciless at 3 in the afternoon, beating down on the endless expanse of red rock and sagebrush, like the wrath of an angry god. But Eleanor Winters barely felt its burn anymore. The pain in her feet torn and bleeding from 3 days of running barefoot across the unforgiving desert had long since faded into a dull throb that matched the rhythm of her labored breathing. What consumed her now was something far worse than physical agony. It was the cold certainty that she was going to die out here, alone with her unborn child, still moving restlessly in her swollen belly. The carved symbol on her forehead had stopped bleeding hours ago, but she could feel the raised flesh pulling tight every time she squinted against the glare. The mark of the chosen, her father had called it, as he pressed the heated blade to her skin just 4 days ago. The mark that would identify her to the faithful, the mark that would guide them to her no matter how far she ran. "Please," she whispered to the empty sky, her voice cracked and hoarse. "Please, just let me get somewhere safe." But safety was a concept that had been beaten out of her long ago in the compound of the Society of Divine Light. Safety was what other people had, people who hadn't been born to Abraham Winters, the self-proclaimed prophet who spoke directly with God and demanded absolute obedience from his followers. People who hadn't spent 22 years being told that their primary purpose in life was to bear the child who would bring the rains back to the desert. The prophecy. Always the prophecy. Eleanor stumbled over a piece of sandstone and fell hard to her knees, her hands instinctively going to protect her belly as she hit the ground. The baby kicked sharply as if protesting the rough treatment, and she found herself talking to the child she'd never wanted but now desperately needed to protect. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered, struggling to her feet. "I'm so sorry for all of this, but I won't let them have you. I won't let them use you the way they used me." The memory of that final night at the compound washed over her like a wave of nausea. She'd been kneeling in the circle of devotion surrounded by the 37 members of her father's congregation, all of them chanting in the old tongue that Abraham claimed God had taught him in a vision. The fire in the center of the circle had cast dancing shadows on their faces, making them look like demons rather than the faithful servants they believed themselves to be. "The time has come," Abraham had intoned, his deep voice carrying easily across the desert air. "The child stirs in the vessel and the signs are clear. The drought that has plagued this land for 7 years shall end only when the blood of innocence is spilled upon the sacred stones." Eleanor had known what was coming. She'd heard whispers from the other women, seen the way Abraham looked at her belly with hungry eyes, felt the change in the way people treated her as her due date approached. But hearing it spoken aloud, seeing the fanatical gleam in the eyes of people she'd known her entire life, had finally broken through the wall of denial she'd built around herself. "No," she had whispered, and then louder, "No." The silence that followed had been deafening. No one said no to Abraham Winters. No one questioned the will of God as interpreted by his chosen prophet. But Eleanor had gotten to her feet, her hands protectively cradling her belly, and looked her father directly in the eyes. "I won't let you hurt my baby." What happened next would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Abraham's face had twisted with a rage so pure and terrible that she'd actually staggered backward. But it wasn't his anger that had terrified her most. It was the cold calculation that had replaced it a moment later. "Seize her," he'd said simply. and 6 men had moved forward like wolves, closing in on wounded prey. She'd run then blindly and desperately, crashing through the darkness beyond the compound, with no plan except to get as far away as possible. She'd heard them calling her name, heard the sound of vehicles starting up, felt the sweep of flashlight beams cutting through the night behind her, but somehow, by some miracle, she'd made it to the old mining road that led away from their hidden valley, and from there she'd just kept running. Now, 3 days later, she was lost in a landscape that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to venture into it unprepared. She had no water, no food, no shoes, no map. She didn't even know if she was still heading away from the compound or if she'd been walking in circles. The desert all looked the same, endless red rock punctuated by scrub brush, and the occasional Joshua tree reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The contractions had started that morning, subtle at first, but growing stronger and more regular as the day wore on. She was still 3 weeks from her due date, but stress and dehydration were taking their toll. Each time her belly tightened, she had to stop and lean against whatever was nearest, a boulder, a tree, sometimes just her own knees, and breathe through the pain while silently begging the baby to wait just a little longer. "We just need to find someone," she told her unborn child as she crested another low hill. "Anyone, a ranch, a road, a person, someone who can help us." That was when she saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from behind a cluster of red rocks about half a mile away. For a moment she thought she was hallucinating. She'd been seeing mirages all day, phantom oases that vanished as soon as she got close. But this smoke was too steady, too real, too perfectly imperfect to be a trick of her exhausted mind. Eleanor broke into a stumbling run, ignoring the fire in her feet and the sharp ache in her side. The baby seemed to sense her excitement and began moving more actively, pressing against her ribs in a way that made breathing difficult. But she didn't care. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people, and people meant the possibility, however remote, of help. As she got closer, the source of the smoke became clear. It was a small ranch house, weathered and sun-bleached but solid-looking, nestled in a little depression between 3 towering red mesas. There was a barn, a corral with a few horses, and what looked like a vegetable garden enclosed by chicken wire. It was the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen, but as she approached, doubt began to creep in. What if these people knew her father? The Society of Divine Light had contacts throughout the region, sympathizers, suppliers, people who turned a blind eye to their activities in exchange for money or favors. What if she'd stumbled onto the property of someone who would simply load her into a truck and drive her straight back to Abraham? Another contraction hit stronger than any before it, and she doubled over with a gasp that was part pain and part fear. When it passed, she found herself crying, not from the physical discomfort, but from the overwhelming helplessness of her situation. She was completely at the mercy of strangers with nowhere else to go and no other options. The sound of a screen door slamming made her look up sharply. A man had emerged from the house and was walking toward her with long, purposeful strides. He was tall and lean, probably in his late 30s, with dark hair that was just starting to show gray at the temples and skin that spoke of years spent under the desert sun. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were all muscle and old scars. But it was his eyes that made Eleanor freeze in place. They were the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and intense, and they were taking in every detail of her appearance with the kind of systematic assessment that suggested military training or law enforcement. She saw him note the symbol carved into her forehead, the torn and dirty dress that had once been white, the way she was holding her belly, the blood on her feet. "Jesus Christ," he said softly, and his voice carried the slight rasp of a man who'd spent years breathing dust and smoke. "How long have you been walking?" The question was so gentle, so completely different from what she'd expected, that it broke something loose inside her chest. All the fear and exhaustion and desperate hope she'd been holding back came pouring out in a sob that shook her entire body. Please, she managed to say between gasps. Please, I need help. They're going to kill my baby. They're going to kill my baby, and I can't let them. The man was beside her in 3 quick steps, his hands hovering near her arms, as if he wanted to help but wasn't sure how. Hey, it's okay. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you or your baby. She looked up at him through her tears, searching his face for any sign of deception or recognition, but all she saw was concern and a kind of careful compassion that suggested he'd dealt with traumatized people before. You don't understand, she said urgently. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I've done. I know you're pregnant and scared, and you've been walking through the desert for days, he replied firmly. That's all I need to know right now. My name is Mason Reed, and this is my ranch. Can you make it to the house, or do you need me to carry you? The offer was made matter-of-factly, without any hint of impropriety or ulterior motive. Eleanor had never met a man who offered help without expecting something in return, and the simple kindness of it made her cry harder. I can walk, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Another contraction was building, and she could feel her legs starting to shake with exhaustion. Mason must have seen something in her expression, because he made a decision. No, you can't. And there's no shame in needing help. He slipped one arm around her waist and the other under her knees, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Eleanor tensed for a moment. 22 years of conditioning had taught her to fear any man's touch. But Mason's grip was careful and respectful, the embrace of someone who was simply trying to help. What's your name? He asked as he carried her toward the house. Eleanor, she whispered. Eleanor Winters. She felt him miss a step, though he recovered so quickly that she almost thought she'd imagined it. But she hadn't missed the slight tightening of his jaw or the way his eyes had gone from concerned to something harder and more dangerous. Winters, he repeated carefully. Any relation to Abraham Winters? The question hit her like a physical blow. Of course he knew that name. Everyone in this part of Utah knew about Abraham Winters and his prophecies and his followers. The only question was whether Mason Reed was friend or foe. He's my father, she admitted, waiting for him to drop her or turn around and march her straight back to the compound. Instead, Mason's arms tightened around her protectively. Well, he said grimly, that explains a few things. They'd reached the front porch of the house, and Mason kicked the screen door open with his foot. The interior was simple, but clean wood floors worn smooth by years of use, handmade furniture that looked like it had been built to last, and windows that let in plenty of natural light. It smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and something indefinable that Eleanor eventually realized was safety. Mason carried her to a bedroom and settled her gently on the bed, pulling a quilt up to her chin. When's the last time you had water? He asked. I don't know, she admitted. Yesterday, maybe I found a little puddle after the rain 2 nights ago. He disappeared without another word and came back with a glass of water and a damp cloth. Drink this slowly, he instructed, helping her sit up. Too much too fast will make you sick. The water was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted, cool and clean and pure. She wanted to drain the entire glass in one gulp, but Mason kept a firm hand on the bottom, controlling the flow. Easy, he murmured. There's plenty more where that came from. While she drank, he used the damp cloth to gently clean the worst of the dirt and blood from her face. His touch was careful around the carved symbol, and she saw him flinch slightly when he got a close look at it. Who did this to you? He asked quietly. My father. It's the mark of the chosen. It means I'm... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't explain about the prophecy and the sacrifice and the way they'd all looked at her like she was nothing more than a vessel for their salvation. It means you're what? Mason's voice was gentle but insistent. It means I'm supposed to die, she whispered. Me and my baby, for the greater good. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mason's breathing, which had gone slow and deep in the way of a man trying very hard to control his temper. When Eleanor finally worked up the courage to look at his face, she saw an expression of such controlled fury that she instinctively shrank back. "Sorry," he said, immediately schooling his features into something more neutral. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at the situation and at your father. You know about the Society of Divine Light." Mason's laugh was bitter and completely humorless. "Oh, I know all about your father's little cult. I've been tracking groups like his for years. The question is, how much do you know about what he's really been doing?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean the money laundering, the weapons, stockpiling, the connections to other extremist groups across the Southwest. I mean the fact that his prophecies are nothing more than elaborate cons designed to keep his followers under control while he builds his own little kingdom in the desert." Eleanor felt the world shift sideways. He's not my father talks to God. The prophecies are real. The drought is a natural weather pattern that's been going on for decades. Mason interrupted gently. "It has nothing to do with divine punishment or blood sacrifice. Your father is using people's desperation to control them, and he's willing to kill his own daughter and grandchild to maintain that control." The words hit her like physical blows, each one shattering another piece of the worldview she'd been raised with. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend the faith that had shaped her entire life, but she couldn't get past the memory of Abraham's face when she'd refused to cooperate. The cold calculation, the complete lack of paternal love or concern for her welfare. "I don't understand," she whispered. "If you know all this, why haven't you stopped him?" Mason's expression darkened. "Because proof and suspicion are two different things. Your father is careful. He keeps his illegal activities separate from his religious ones, and he's got enough legitimate supporters to make any investigation complicated. Plus, most of his followers are there voluntarily, adult men and women who chose to join his community and follow his teachings." "What about the children?" "What children?" The question was sharp, urgent, and Eleanor realized she'd revealed more than she intended. There are families in the compound, children who were born there." "How many children, Eleanor?" She closed her eyes, trying to remember. "Maybe 15 or 20, some babies, some older kids. They don't go to school or see doctors, or they don't have birth certificates. My father says the outside world would corrupt them." When she opened her eyes, Mason was no longer trying to hide his anger. His jaw was clenched tight, and she could see a vein pulsing in his temple. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. 20 kids with no legal identity, no protection, no connection to the outside world. He looked at her intently. "Eleanor, I need you to tell me everything you know about the compound. The layout, the security, the daily routines, everything." "Why?" "Because those children are in danger. If your father is willing to sacrifice his own daughter and grandchild for his prophecy, what do you think he'll do to kids who aren't even related to him?" The question sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. She'd never thought about it before, but now that Mason had planted the seed, she couldn't stop picturing the faces of the children she'd grown up with. Little Sarah, who couldn't have been more than 5. The twin boys who followed their mother everywhere with wide, trusting eyes. The teenage girls who were already being evaluated for their breeding potential. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, what if you're right?" "I am right," Mason said firmly, "but right now my priority is keeping you safe. Everything else can wait until you've recovered and had your baby in a hospital like a normal person." The mention of the baby made Eleanor suddenly aware that she hadn't felt any movement for several minutes. She pressed her hands to her belly, trying to feel the reassuring push of tiny limbs, but there was nothing. "Something's wrong," she said urgently. "The baby's not moving." Mason was immediately all business. "When did you last feel movement?" "I don't know, maybe 15 minutes ago before we came inside. Could be the baby's sleeping, stress and exhaustion affect them too. But his tone suggested he was more concerned than he was letting on. When did the contractions start? This morning. They're not regular yet, but they're getting stronger. Mason ran a hand through his hair, clearly thinking hard. Okay, we need to get you to a hospital, but the nearest one is 2 hours away. And I don't like the idea of you being in labor in the back of my truck for that long. Let me call and see if I can get a helicopter out here. The mention of involving other people sent panic racing through Eleanor's system. No, you can't call anyone. They'll find me. My father has people everywhere, connections you don't know about. The moment you make that call, they'll know where I am. Eleanor, you need medical attention, please. She grabbed his arm with both hands, her grip desperate and pleading. Please, just give me a few hours. Let me rest. Let me get my strength back. If the contractions get worse or if something goes wrong, then we'll figure it out. But right now, I just need to feel safe for a little while. Mason studied her face for a long moment, clearly torn between his desire to help and his recognition that she was probably right about her father's reach. Finally, he nodded. A few hours, he agreed. But if your condition changes at all, if you start bleeding, if the contractions get closer together, if the baby doesn't start moving again soon, we're going to the hospital, whether it's safe or not. Deal. Deal. Good. Now you need food and rest. When's the last time you ate? Eleanor tried to remember. Day before yesterday, maybe, we had bread and cheese at the evening meal, but I couldn't keep much down. I've been nauseated for weeks. Mason disappeared again and came back with a tray containing a bowl of soup, some crackers, and another glass of water. Start with this, chicken broth with some vegetables. Easy on the stomach, but full of nutrients you and the baby need. The soup was another revelation. Eleanor couldn't remember the last time she'd tasted food that had been prepared with care rather than mere sustenance in mind. The broth was rich and flavorful. The vegetables perfectly tender, the whole thing, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that made her mouth water for more. This is incredible, she said between spoonfuls. Did you make this? Mason shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. Cooking relaxes me, and I learned a long time ago that if you're going to eat something, it might as well taste good. Where did you learn to cook like this? Army, he said simply. Spent 6 years as a medic, and part of that job is knowing how to keep people fed and healthy under less than ideal circumstances. You were in the Army, 10th Mountain Division, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. His tone was matter-of-fact, but Eleanor caught something in his expression that suggested the memories weren't entirely pleasant. Is that where you learned about groups like my father's? Mason was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he said, I learned about extremist groups over there, yeah? Religious fanatics, cult leaders, people who use faith as a weapon to control others. When I came back to the States, I discovered we had plenty of our own homegrown versions. Is that why you're here in the middle of nowhere? Another long pause. I came here because I needed space to think and to heal. The desert has a way of putting things in perspective. Eleanor finished the soup and leaned back against the pillows, feeling more human than she had in days. The baby chose that moment to give her a sharp kick to the ribs, and she gasped in surprise and relief. There we go, Mason said, noting her expression. Feeling better. Much, thank you for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't need to repay me. This is just what people should do for each other. But even as he said it, Eleanor could see something troubled in his expression. There was more to his story, she realized. More to his connection to her father and the society of divine light. And somehow she had the feeling that learning the truth was going to change everything. For now, though, she was warm and safe and fed with her baby moving actively in her womb, and a man who seemed genuinely committed to protecting them both. It was more than she'd dared to hope for when she'd fled into the desert 3 days ago. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and orange that took her breath away. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Winters allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she and her child might actually have a chance at freedom. But in the distance, so faint she almost thought she'd imagined it, she heard the sound of engines. Multiple vehicles moving fast across the desert floor. They were coming. Mason's head snapped toward the window. At the same instant, Eleanor heard the engines. His entire body went rigid, and she watched as years of military training kicked in, transforming him from a gentle caregiver into something altogether more dangerous. "How many vehicles does your father typically travel with?" he asked, his voice completely calm despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "3 or 4, usually, sometimes more if he's bringing the entire council." Eleanor struggled to sit up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But Mason, you don't understand. They won't just ask for me back. My father doesn't negotiate. He doesn't compromise. If he's decided I need to return, he'll do whatever it takes." Mason was already moving, crossing to a wooden chest beneath the window and pulling out items that made Eleanor's blood run cold. A pistol, which he checked with practiced efficiency before sliding into a shoulder holster. A rifle that looked military-grade and well-maintained. Boxes of ammunition. "How many people are we talking about?" he asked as he loaded the rifle. "Maybe 8 or 10, all men, all completely loyal to my father." She watched him work with growing horror. "Mason, please, just give me to them. I won't have your blood on my hands, too." He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face was unlike anything she'd ever seen. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was plenty of that simmering beneath the surface. It was something deeper and more personal, a kind of cold fury that spoke of old wounds and unfinished business. "Eleanor, I want you to listen to me very carefully," he said, moving back to her side but keeping the rifle within easy reach. "I didn't pull you out of that desert just to hand you back to the people who carved up your face and want to kill your baby. That's not going to happen, not while I'm breathing. But you don't know what he's capable of." "Actually, I do." Mason's voice was grim. "I know exactly what your father is capable of, more than you might think." Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of engines grew louder and dust began to rise beyond the windows. Mason moved to peer through the curtains, his face set in hard lines. 4 vehicles, he reported. "Looks like SUVs, all black, probably armored. Professional setup." He glanced back at her. "They're not taking any chances." Eleanor felt another contraction building and gripped the blanket with white knuckles as pain rolled through her belly. The baby was responding to her stress, moving restlessly and pressing against her ribs in a way that made breathing difficult. "The contractions are getting stronger," she managed to say when it passed. Mason's jaw tightened. How much stronger? A lot stronger, and closer together. Son of a bitch. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly weighing their options. "Okay, new plan. There's a storm cellar beneath this house built during the Cold War by the previous owner. It's got its own ventilation system and enough supplies to last a week. I'm going to put you down there." "What about you?" "I'm going to have a conversation with your father." The vehicles were close enough now that they could hear doors slamming and voices calling out in the gathering dusk. Eleanor recognized one of them immediately, the deep, commanding tone that had shaped every day of her life until 4 days ago. "Daughter," Abraham's voice carried easily across the desert air, "I know you're in there, child. Come out now and all will be forgiven." Mason helped Eleanor to her feet and led her quickly to a door she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a bookshelf that swung away on silent hinges. Below was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "There's a lantern at the bottom of the stairs," he told her quietly. "Food, water, medical supplies, everything you need. No matter what you hear up here, don't come out until I come to get you. Promise me." "Mason, promise me, Eleanor." She looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw something there that made her believe he might actually be able to protect her. "I promise." He helped her down the stairs, moving carefully to accommodate her awkward bulk and the increasing frequency of her contractions. The cellar was larger than she'd expected, with concrete walls and a ceiling lined with wooden beams. True to his word, there were shelves stocked with canned food, water jugs, and what looked like enough medical supplies to stock a small clinic. "Mason," she called softly as he started back up the stairs. "Who are you?" "Really?" He paused, silhouetted against the rectangle of light from above. "Someone who should have stopped your father a long time ago." Then the hidden door swung shut, leaving her alone in the dim circle of lantern light, with only the sound of her own breathing and the distant voices above. She could hear Mason's boots crossing the wooden floor, then the sound of the front door opening. The voices outside grew clearer, and she pressed her ear to the ceiling, trying to make out what was being said. "Afternoon," Mason's voice casual and friendly. "Something I can help you folks with. We're looking for a young woman." Abraham replied, his tone carrying the kind of authority he was used to having obeyed without question. "About 5'6", dark hair, pregnant. She may have come this way." "Can't say I've seen anyone like that. This is pretty remote territory. Not many people come through here." "The woman is my daughter," Abraham continued, and Eleanor could hear the subtle shift in his tone, still controlled but with an edge of steel underneath. "She's sick, confused, not thinking clearly. We're very concerned about her welfare." "I'm sure you are," Mason replied, and there was something in his voice that made Eleanor shiver. "Must be hard having a daughter go missing like that. Indeed, perhaps you wouldn't mind if we searched your property, just to be thorough." "Actually, I would mind. This is private land and you folks don't have a warrant." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Eleanor could practically feel the standoff happening above her head, two strong-willed men sizing each other up and finding the other wanting. "I don't believe you. You understand the situation," Abraham said finally, his voice dropping to the register he used when he was about to pronounce judgment. "My daughter is carrying a child that is precious to our community, a child that fulfills ancient prophecies. We cannot allow her to wander lost in the wilderness." "Ancient prophecies," Mason repeated, and there was definitely mockery in his tone now. "Right. Well, like I said, I haven't seen anyone. Maybe you should try the main highway. More traffic there." Another long silence, then the sound of footsteps moving closer to the house. Eleanor held her breath, pressing both hands to her belly as another contraction built. The baby seemed to sense the danger, moving frantically, as if trying to find a safer position. "Mr. Reed," Abraham's voice was closer now, probably right outside the front door. "I know who you are." "Do you now?" "Former Staff Sergeant Mason Reed, 10th Mountain Division. Medic. 3 tours overseas, then 5 years with the ATF investigating domestic terrorism and extremist groups. Currently on indefinite medical leave following an incident in Nevada that left 3 agents dead and yourself with enough psychological trauma to end your career." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Mason worked for the government, had worked for the government, and he'd been investigating groups like her father's. No wonder he knew so much about the Society of Divine Light. "That's an interesting story," Mason replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Where'd you hear it?" "I make it my business to know about people who take an interest in my community, Sergeant, just as I made it my business to learn about the investigation you were conducting into the disappearance of the Hoffman family 3 years ago." Even from her hiding place, Eleanor could hear the sharp intake of breath from Mason. Abraham had struck a nerve. "The Hoffmans were good people," Mason said, and for the first time there was real emotion in his voice. "They had 2 young children. What happened to them?" "They found peace," Abraham replied serenely, "as did the Martinez family and the Johnsons and all the others who came to us seeking spiritual enlightenment. They found exactly what they were looking for." "Which was what mass graves in the desert?" Abraham's laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, Sergeant Reed, You still don't understand, do you? There are no mass graves, no bodies buried in the sand. The people who join our community do so willingly, and they stay because they want to stay, because they've found something worth more than the hollow materialism of the outside world. Then why won't you let them leave? Who says we don't? Anyone who truly wishes to go is free to do so. But the thing is, once people experience the power of true faith, once they understand their place in God's plan, they don't want to leave. They want to be part of something greater than themselves. Eleanor felt another contraction building stronger than the others, and had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The conversation above was becoming more heated, voices rising, and she could hear other men moving around the property. "Boss," an unfamiliar voice called out, "found fresh tire tracks leading to the house, recent ones. Search the outbuildings," Abraham commanded. "She's here somewhere." "You don't have permission to search my property," Mason said sharply. "I don't need permission," Abraham replied, and now all pretense of civility was gone. "I'm retrieving stolen property." "Stolen property? You're talking about your daughter." "I'm talking about a vessel that contains the fulfillment of prophecy, a child whose blood will bring rain to this desert and salvation to the faithful. My daughter is simply the means by which God has chosen to deliver his gift to the world." The absolute coldness in Abraham's voice made Eleanor physically sick. She'd known her father was capable of ruthlessness, but to hear him describe her and her unborn child as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded was worse than any physical blow. "You're insane," Mason said flatly. "I'm a prophet of the Most High God," Abraham replied with complete conviction. "I speak with his voice and carry out his will, and his will is that the child be returned to us for the greater good of all creation. Over my dead body, if necessary." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleanor could hear men moving around the house now, their footsteps heavy on the wooden porch, their voices calling out coordinates and positions like a military operation. They were surrounding the building, cutting off any possible escape routes. Another contraction hit, and this time she couldn't stop the soft moan that escaped her lips. The pain was getting worse, coming faster, and she was beginning to realize that her baby might actually be coming tonight in a storm cellar while armed men hunted for her above. "She's in labor," she whispered to herself, pressing both hands to her belly. "Oh God, the baby's coming." Above her, the conversation had devolved into barely controlled hostility. "Last chance, Sergeant," Abraham was saying. "Turn over my daughter willingly and you can walk away from this. Continue to interfere and I'll consider you an enemy combatant in a holy war." "Holy war?" Mason repeated with disgust. "You really believe your own bullshit, don't you? I believe in the Word of God as it has been revealed to me through years of prayer and fasting and divine communion. I believe that the drought plaguing this region is a punishment for mankind's sins, and that only the sacrifice of innocent blood will convince the Almighty to restore his blessings to the land. And what happens if you're wrong? What happens if you kill your daughter and grandchild and it doesn't rain? Then it will be because the sacrifice was insufficient." Abraham replied without hesitation, "Because more blood is required. Because the faithless and the doubters prevented the proper completion of the ritual." "Jesus Christ! Do not take the Lord's name in vain, Sergeant, not when you're about to meet him." The sound that followed made Eleanor's blood run cold. The distinctive metallic click of multiple weapons being cocked simultaneously. Mason was outnumbered at least 8-1, surrounded by fanatics who believed they were carrying out God's will. There was no way he could fight them all and win, but apparently Mason Reed had never learned the meaning of impossible odds. "You want her?" His voice carried clearly through the floorboards, and there was something in his tone that spoke of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Come and take her." The first gunshot shattered the evening air like thunder, followed immediately by a volley of return fire that made the entire house shake. Eleanor pressed herself against the concrete wall, trying to make herself as small as possible, while her unborn child kicked frantically in response to the violence above. Glass shattered as windows exploded inward. Heavy footsteps pounded across the floor, accompanied by shouting voices and the distinctive whine of ricocheting bullets. Someone screamed a high, agonized sound that cut through the chaos like a knife. "Find her," Abraham's voice boomed over the gunfire. "Tear this place apart if you have to, but find her." More footsteps, more shouting, more gunfire. The smell of cordite and smoke began to filter down into the cellar, making Eleanor's eyes water. She could hear men ransacking the rooms above, throwing furniture around, ripping apart anything that might conceal a hiding place. Another contraction hit the strongest yet, and this time she couldn't contain her cry of pain. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, seeming impossibly loud in the small space. She held her breath, praying no one above had heard, but the chaos upstairs was too intense for her small sound to carry. The gunfight seemed to go on forever, but was probably only a few minutes. Gradually, the shooting died down to occasional single shots, then silence. Eleanor strained her ears, trying to figure out what was happening, but could only hear muffled voices and the sound of someone moving heavy objects around. Then, clear as a bell, she heard Mason's voice. "Abraham Winters, you are under arrest for kidnapping, child endangerment, weapons violations, and conspiracy to commit murder." Eleanor's heart leaped. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived the firefight and was now reading her father his rights, like the federal agent he'd once been. "You have no authority here," Abraham replied, his voice strained but still defiant. "I have all the authority I need," Mason shot back. "I've been documenting your activities for 3 years, building a case that would hold up in federal court. The missing families, the weapons stockpiling, the financial crimes, all of it. The only thing I was missing was a witness willing to testify." "You'll never get a conviction. My followers will never betray me." "Your followers, maybe not. But your daughter, the one you carved up and tried to sacrifice, the one who's been living under your thumb for 22 years, I think she might have some things to say." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of someone crying. Not Eleanor. The sound was coming from above, from one of the men who had come with Abraham, someone who was apparently having second thoughts about the holy war they'd just participated in. "Joshua," Abraham's voice was sharp with command. "Control yourself." "I can't do this anymore, Abraham," the crying voice replied. "That girl is your daughter, your own flesh and blood. How can you ask us to—" "I ask nothing," Abraham interrupted coldly. "I command as God commands through me. If your faith is insufficient to carry out his will, then perhaps you should reconsider your place among the chosen." Another contraction gripped Eleanor, and this time she felt something she'd never experienced before, a sudden, overwhelming pressure and the unmistakable sensation of her water breaking. Warm fluid soaked through her dress and pooled on the concrete floor beneath her. "No," she whispered desperately. "Not now, please, not now." But her body had made the decision for her. After 3 days of trauma and stress, and running through the desert, after hours of increasingly strong contractions, her baby had decided it was time to be born. Whether she was ready or not, whether it was safe or not, whether there were armed fanatics hunting for her or not. The next contraction was different from all the others, deeper, more purposeful, accompanied by an irresistible urge to push. Eleanor bit down hard on her own hand to keep from screaming, tasting blood as her teeth broke the skin. Above her, the conversation continued. "Where is she, Mason?" Abraham's voice had taken on a different quality, less commanding and more pleading. "I know you have her. I can feel her presence. She's my daughter, my own blood. Surely you can understand a father's need to protect his child." "Protect her?" Mason's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You call carving symbols into her face protecting her. You call planning to murder her and her baby protecting her. I call it fulfilling the will of the Almighty. Sometimes love requires sacrifice. Sometimes protection requires what appears to be cruelty to those who cannot see the larger picture." "The larger picture," Mason repeated. Right, and what happens to all those other children in your compound when you decide their blood is needed for the larger picture? How many more prophecies are going to require innocent lives? The question seemed to catch Abraham off guard. There was a long pause before he answered, and when he did, his voice was less certain than it had been. The children will be protected. They are precious to us, raised in the true faith, kept pure from the corruption of the outside world, until they're not useful anymore, until they ask inconvenient questions, or try to leave, or simply stop believing in your divine mission. You don't understand the depth of their faith. These children have been raised to understand their purpose, their place in God's plan. They would never, Eleanor did. The simple statement hung in the air like a condemnation. Abraham had no response to it because Mason was right. If Abraham's own daughter, raised from birth in his teachings, indoctrinated from childhood in his prophecies, could ultimately reject his authority and flee into the desert rather than submit to sacrifice, then any of the other children could do the same. Another contraction hit Eleanor, and this time she couldn't stop herself from crying out. The sound was muffled, but still audible, and she heard the conversation above pause abruptly. "What was that?" one of Abraham's men asked. "Sounded like it came from below," another replied. "There's a basement," a third voice added. "Storm cellar looks like. Doors hidden behind this bookshelf." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. They'd found the entrance. In moments, they would be down here with her, and she would be dragged back to the compound to fulfill the prophecy that demanded her death. Her baby would be born only to die sacrificed on an altar to a God who existed only in her father's twisted imagination. But then Mason's voice cut through her panic. "You're not going anywhere near that cellar," he said, and there was something final and implacable in his tone. "You can't stop all of us, Sergeant. You're one man against 8. 7, the crying voice corrected. "I won't be part of this anymore, Abraham. I'm done." 6, another voice added quietly. "This has gone too far." Eleanor could hear Abraham's fury even through the floorboards. "Cowards, faithless cowards. The lot of you. When the rains come and the desert blooms, when the prophecy is fulfilled and the chosen are rewarded with eternal life, remember that you abandoned God's work in his hour of greatest need." "The only thing I'll remember," Mason said coldly, "is that I stopped a madman from murdering his own family." The next contraction was overwhelming, a pain so intense that Eleanor couldn't breathe through it. She felt her body bearing down involuntarily, pushing whether she wanted it to or not, and she realized with crystal clarity that her baby was going to be born in the next few minutes. "Mason," she called out, no longer caring who heard her. "Mason, I need help." The response was immediate. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor above, and she heard the hidden door swing open. But instead of Abraham or his remaining followers, it was Mason who appeared at the top of the stairs, his shirt torn and bloody, his face grim but determined. "How bad?" he asked, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "Bad," she gasped as another contraction peaked. "The baby's coming now." Mason took in the scene with the practiced eye of a combat medic. The broken water, the unmistakable signs of imminent delivery, the pain written across every line of Eleanor's face. "Okay," he said calmly, moving to the medical supplies he'd stocked in the cellar. "We can do this. I've delivered babies before in worse conditions than this." "What about—" She gestured toward the ceiling where they could still hear voices arguing. "Abraham and his remaining men are contained for now. Joshua and Marcus decided they didn't want any part of murdering women and children, so the odds are a lot more even, and I called for backup before this whole thing started." "Backup. Federal marshals, FBI, ATF, the whole alphabet soup. They should be here within the hour." He was pulling on surgical gloves as he spoke, his movements quick and efficient. "But it looks like your daughter has her own timeline." "Daughter?" Eleanor gasped. "Just a guess," Mason replied with a small smile. "But she's got your stubborn streak. Deciding to be born in the middle of a gunfight takes a special kind of determination. Despite everything, the pain, the fear, the chaos above, Eleanor found herself laughing. It was a sound somewhere between hysteria and genuine amusement, but it was the first time she'd laughed in months. The moment of levity was interrupted by another massive contraction, and suddenly Mason was all business again. "Okay, Eleanor, this is it. I can see the baby's head. On the next contraction, I need you to push as hard as you can." She bore down with everything she had, gripping Mason's free hand so tightly she was probably cutting off his circulation. But he didn't complain, just encouraged her with quiet words and professional competence. "That's it. That's perfect. Heads out. One more push should do it." The final contraction seemed to tear her apart from the inside. But then suddenly the pressure was gone and she could hear the most beautiful sound in the world. The strong, angry cry of a healthy newborn baby. "It's a girl," Mason announced, holding up a tiny, perfect human being who was clearly outraged at being forced out of her warm, safe hiding place. "And she's got excellent lungs." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as Mason placed the baby on her chest, still attached by the umbilical cord, but breathing strongly and waving tiny fists at the world. She was beautiful, red and wrinkled and covered in vernix, but absolutely perfect. "Hello, little one?" Eleanor whispered, touching one impossibly small hand. "I'm your mama." The baby's cries quieted at the sound of her voice, and dark eyes that seemed far too aware for someone who had been born only minutes ago focused on Eleanor's face. Above them, the argument seemed to have died down. Eleanor could hear new voices, official-sounding men and women who spoke with the kind of authority that suggested badges and warrants and the full power of the federal government. "Looks like the cavalry arrived right on time," Mason said as he clamped and cut the umbilical cord. "Your father and his remaining followers are about to discover what happens when you threaten federal witnesses and engage in armed confrontation with law enforcement." As if summoned by his words, a new voice called down from above. "Agent Reed, everything okay down there?" "Fine, Marshal Williams," Mason called back. "But I'm going to need a medical helicopter out here. We've got a newborn who needs to be checked out at a hospital. Already on the way, ETA 15 minutes. Eleanor looked up at Mason in confusion. "Agent Reed." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "I may have been a little less than completely honest about my current employment status. I'm not on medical leave. I'm deep undercover and have been for 3 years, building a case against your father and groups like his. So everything you told me was true as far as it went. I was Army. I am a trained medic, and I have been investigating domestic terrorism. I just left out the part about still being on active duty." Eleanor stared at him, trying to process this new information. "You knew who I was before you found me in the desert." "I suspected. I've been watching the compound, documenting comings and goings, waiting for someone to break ranks. When I saw you running across the desert pregnant and marked with that symbol, I knew exactly who you had to be. So this was all part of your investigation, helping me." Mason was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on making sure both she and the baby were stable. Finally, he looked up and met her eyes. "It started that way," he admitted. "But the moment I saw what they'd done to you, the moment I heard about the prophecy and the planned sacrifice, it stopped being about the investigation. It became about making sure you and your daughter stayed alive." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of rotors filled the air above them. The medical helicopter had arrived, and within minutes, paramedics were descending into the cellar to assess both mother and baby. "Both vitals look good," one of them announced after a quick examination, "but we'll want to get them to the hospital for a full workup. Mom's been through significant trauma, and the baby was born under less than ideal conditions." As they prepared to transport her, Eleanor caught sight of her father being led away in handcuffs by federal marshals. Abraham Winters looked older than she'd ever seen him, His shoulders stooped and his face etched with defeat. For just a moment their eyes met across the chaos of the rescue operation. He mouthed a single word, "Forgive." Eleanor looked down at her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the commotion around them and felt something shift inside her chest. The fear that had ruled her life for 22 years was still there, but it was no longer the dominant emotion. What she felt now was a fierce, protective love, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She looked back at her father and slowly, deliberately shook her head. There would be no forgiveness. Not for the years of manipulation and control, not for the symbol carved into her forehead, not for the plan to murder her and her innocent child in the name of prophecy. But there might eventually be peace and freedom and the chance to raise her daughter in a world where love didn't require sacrifice, where protection didn't require cruelty, and where faith was a choice rather than a weapon. As the paramedics loaded her into the helicopter, Mason squeezed her hand one last time. "What are you going to name her?" he asked. Eleanor looked down at her daughter's perfect face and smiled. "Faith," she said softly. "Her name is Faith." The helicopter lifted off just as the first drops of rain began to fall on the desert below. Eleanor watched through the small window as Mason's ranch grew smaller beneath them, the flashing lights of federal vehicles creating a constellation of red and blue against the darkening landscape. Faith stirred in her arms, making the soft, mewling sounds of a newborn, adjusting to the world outside the womb. "Ironic, isn't it?" the paramedic treating Eleanor said, nodding toward the rain streaking the window. "Your father's prophecy about the drought ending. Looks like Mother Nature had her own timeline." Eleanor pressed her lips to Faith's downy head, breathing in that distinctive newborn scent that seemed to promise infinite possibilities. "It's just weather," she whispered more to herself than to the paramedic. "It's just rain." But even as she said it, part of her couldn't help wondering, what if her father had been right about the drought ending? What if the timing was more than coincidence? She pushed the thoughts away, refusing to let Abraham's twisted logic take root in her mind again. She was free now, free to think her own thoughts, make her own decisions, raise her daughter without the shadow of prophecy hanging over them. The hospital in Cedar City was a small regional facility, but it was equipped to handle both emergency deliveries and the kind of trauma Eleanor had endured. Within an hour of landing, both she and Faith had been thoroughly examined, cleaned up, and settled into a private room that felt impossibly luxurious after 3 days in the desert and hours in a storm cellar. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had clearly dealt with unusual circumstances before. She checked Faith's reflexes and breathing with practiced efficiency while explaining what would happen next. "Both of you are in remarkably good condition considering what you've been through," she told Eleanor. "The baby's weight is good for someone born 3 weeks early. Her APGAR scores were excellent and all her reflexes are normal. You're dehydrated and exhausted, and that mark on your forehead is going to need specialized care to minimize scarring, but physically you're both going to be fine." "What about the other kind of fine?" Eleanor asked quietly. Dr. Chen paused in her examination of Faith and looked up with understanding eyes. "You mean psychologically, emotionally, that's going to take time and probably professional help. What you've experienced would be traumatic for anyone, but growing up in that kind of environment with that level of control and manipulation." She shook her head. "It's going to be a process. But the fact that you were strong enough to run to protect your daughter, to survive what you survived, that tells me you have the resilience to heal." A soft knock at the door interrupted them, and Mason appeared in the doorway. He'd cleaned up and changed clothes, trading his torn and bloody shirt for a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders and the exhaustion in his eyes. "How are they?" he asked Dr. Chen. "Healthy and stable. They'll need to stay for observation tonight, but barring any complications, they should be able to leave tomorrow." Mason nodded, then looked at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Can I come in?" "Of course." She shifted slightly in the hospital bed, making room. "Is my father in federal custody? Him and 4 of his remaining followers. They're facing charges that will likely keep them locked up for the rest of their lives." Mason pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavily. "The compound is being searched as we speak. We found evidence of financial crimes, weapons violations, and documentation of the families that have joined the community over the years." "What about the children?" "Safe. Child Protective Services took custody of all 17 minors found on the property. They're being evaluated by medical and psychological professionals, and efforts are underway to locate any living family members who might be able to take them in." Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So it's over, really over." Mason was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "The immediate danger is over, yes, but there are going to be complications. Legal proceedings, testimony, media attention. Your father built his organization over more than 2 decades, and dismantling it completely is going to take time." "Will I have to testify?" "Eventually, yes, but not until you're ready, and you'll have protection, support, counseling, whatever you need." Faith chose that moment to wake up, her tiny fists waving as she let out a surprisingly loud cry for someone so small. Eleanor automatically began the soothing motions she'd seen other mothers in the compound use, rocking gently and making soft shushing sounds. "She's beautiful," Mason said softly, and there was something in his voice that made Eleanor look up sharply. "You saved her life," she said simply. "Saved both our lives. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job." "Was it just your job when you held my hand while I was in labor, when you told me I was going to be okay, when you promised to protect us?" Eleanor's voice was quiet but pointed, because it felt like more than that. Mason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign that he was uncomfortable. "Eleanor, I need to be honest with you about something, about why I was really at that ranch, why I was watching your father's compound." She felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What do you mean?" 3 years ago, a family named the Hoffmans disappeared while camping in the area. David and Susan Hoffman and their 2 children, 8-year-old Michael and 6-year-old Emma. They were last seen at a gas station about 20 miles from your father's compound, asking for directions to some local hiking trails. Eleanor shifted Faith to her other arm, trying to remember. "I don't recall any new families joining us around that time." "That's because they didn't join willingly. We found evidence that they were taken probably because they saw something they weren't supposed to see. Maybe stumbled across one of your father's weapons caches or witnessed something related to his illegal activities." The implication hit her like a physical blow. "You think my father killed them? I think your father is capable of doing whatever he believes is necessary to protect his operation. And I think a family of witnesses who couldn't be controlled or converted would represent an unacceptable risk." Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to process this new layer of horror. She'd known her father was ruthless, had seen him discipline followers who stepped out of line, but the idea that he might be responsible for the deaths of innocent children. "There's more," Mason continued quietly. "Susan Hoffman was 6 months pregnant when they disappeared." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleanor opened her eyes and stared at Mason, seeing the pain and guilt written across his features. "You think he killed a pregnant woman and her children, and then 3 years later planned to kill me and my baby?" Her voice was hollow, empty of emotion. "You think he's done this before?" "I think your father has been eliminating threats to his organization for years and disguising those eliminations as religious experiences or divine interventions. People who join the community and then have second thoughts. Families who ask too many questions. Individuals who threaten to expose his activities to outside authorities." Faith began to fuss again, and Eleanor automatically began rocking her, the gentle motion helping to calm her own racing thoughts as much as the baby's distress. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because you have a right to know who your father really is. And because when this goes to trial, the prosecution is going to need you to testify not just about what happened to you, but about what you might have witnessed over the years. Other disappearances, other divine interventions, other times when people who posed problems to the community simply vanished." The full weight of what Mason was saying settled over Eleanor like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just a victim who had escaped. She was a witness to decades of potential crimes, someone whose testimony could help bring justice for families like the Hoffmans. "I don't know if I can do that," she whispered. "Stand up in court in front of everyone and talk about all of it." "You don't have to decide anything right now," Mason said gently. "You just gave birth a few hours ago after escaping from a cult and surviving a gunfight. You're allowed to take time to heal, to process, to figure out what comes next." A new voice from the doorway interrupted their conversation. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I need to speak with Ms. Winters." They turned to see a woman in a dark suit standing in the entrance to the room. She was probably in her early 40s with short brown hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested law enforcement or government work. "Special Agent Patricia Monroe, FBI," the woman said, showing her credentials. "I'm leading the investigation into the Society of Divine Light and related activities." Eleanor instinctively pulled Faith closer, a protective gesture that wasn't lost on Agent Monroe. "I'm not here to pressure you or demand immediate statements," Monroe said, her voice carefully modulated to be non-threatening. "I just wanted to introduce myself and let you know that the Bureau is committed to ensuring your safety and supporting you through this process." "What does that mean exactly?" Eleanor asked. "It means that until we're certain there are no remaining threats from your father's organization, you and your daughter will be under federal protection. It means you'll have access to counseling, legal representation, financial support, and anything else you need to build a new life. And it means that when and if you decide you're ready to help us seek justice for other victims, we'll be here to support you through that process as well." Mason leaned forward in his chair. "What about the other followers, the ones who weren't arrested? We're still tracking down individuals who may have been involved in criminal activities, but many of your father's followers appear to have been victims themselves rather than co-conspirators. They're being interviewed and offered support services as needed." "And my Uncle Joshua?" Eleanor asked. "He was my father's second in command." Agent Monroe's expression grew grim. "Joshua Winters was killed during the confrontation at the ranch. He drew a weapon on federal agents and refused multiple commands to surrender." The news should have shocked her, but Eleanor found that she felt nothing at all about her uncle's death. Joshua had been one of her father's most devoted followers, completely committed to the prophecy and the idea that her baby's sacrifice would bring salvation to the community. In many ways, he'd been more dangerous than Abraham because his faith had been absolute and unquestioning. "I know this is overwhelming," Agent Monroe continued, "but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. There are people, good people, who are committed to helping you and Faith build whatever kind of life you want." Faith had fallen asleep again, her tiny face peaceful and relaxed. Eleanor studied her daughter's features, looking for traces of Abraham or the Winters family line, but all she could see was innocence and potential. This little girl would never know. The compound never be told that her purpose was to die for someone else's salvation, never have symbols carved into her skin to mark her as property of a madman's god. "What happens next?" she asked. "Next you rest," Agent Monroe replied. "Tomorrow, when you're discharged from the hospital, you'll be moved to a safe location where you can begin the process of recovery. There's no timeline, no pressure, no demands. You set the pace. And if I decide I can't testify, if I can't face a courtroom full of people and talk about everything that happened?" Agent Monroe exchanged a glance with Mason before answering. "Then we'll respect that decision and work with whatever you're able to give us, but I hope you'll consider it when you're ready. Your testimony could prevent other families from experiencing what the Hoffmans went through. It could help other victims get justice." After Agent Monroe left the room, fell into a comfortable silence. Mason remained in his chair beside the bed, occasionally glancing at Faith, but mostly just being present in the way that people do when they don't know what to say but don't want to leave. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said finally. "Of course." "The night you found me, you said something about this being personal, about having unfinished business with my father. What did you mean?" Mason was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was the agent assigned to investigate the Hoffman family disappearance. I spent 2 years following leads, interviewing witnesses, trying to build a case. But your father was careful and his followers were loyal, and I could never get enough evidence to move forward with charges. So you went undercover. I requested the assignment. Against the advice of my supervisors, against the recommendations of the psychological evaluation team, against every voice of reason that told me I was too emotionally invested to be objective." "Why?" Mason looked at her then, and she saw pain in some of his eyes that went deeper than professional frustration. "Because Emma Hoffman would have been 9 years old this year. Because Michael would have been 11. Because their parents were good people who just wanted to show their kids some beautiful country and ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time." His voice broke slightly. "Because I promised Susan Hoffman's mother that I would find out what happened to her daughter and grandchildren, and I spent 3 years failing to keep that promise." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You couldn't have known I would run. You couldn't have planned for me to escape when I did." "No, but I could have done something sooner. I could have found a way to get evidence to build a case to stop your father before he got to the point of planning to sacrifice his own daughter." Mason rubbed his face with both hands. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been strong enough to run, if you'd stayed and gone through with the ceremony, if I'd failed another family." "But you didn't fail," Eleanor said firmly. "You saved us. You saved me and Faith, and you stopped my father from hurting anyone else, the Hoffman family." She swallowed hard. "They can't be brought back, but their deaths won't be meaningless if they help prevent other families from suffering the same fate." Faith stirred in her arms, making soft snuffling sounds that made both adults smile despite the heaviness of their conversation. "She's going to grow up free," Eleanor said, looking down at her daughter. "She's never going to know what it feels like to be told her life doesn't belong to her. She's never going to be afraid that loving someone means being willing to die for them." "What kind of life do you want for her?" Mason asked. "Normal," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "I want her to go to school and make friends and argue with me about homework and dating and all the things normal teenagers argue about with their mothers. I want her to believe in things because they make sense to her, not because someone threatens her if she doesn't. I want her to know that love is supposed to make you feel safe, not scared." "And what kind of life do you want for yourself?" The question caught her off guard. For 22 years, her life had belonged to other people first, her father, then the prophecy, then the idea that her only purpose was to bear a child for sacrifice. The concept of choosing her own path, her own goals, her own future was both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been allowed to think about what I wanted before. But I know I want to learn things. I want to read books that aren't religious texts. I want to understand how the world really works outside the compound. I want to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by someone else's expectations." "That sounds like a good place to start." The door opened again, this time admitting Dr. Chen for the evening checkup. She examined both Faith and Eleanor with the same thorough efficiency she'd shown earlier, pronouncing herself satisfied with their progress. The baby's feeding well, her color is good, and her reflexes remain normal, she reported. And you're recovering nicely from the delivery. I don't see any reason you can't be discharged tomorrow morning. After the doctor left, Mason stood to go. I should let you get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Mason, Eleanor called as he reached the door. Will I see you again? After tomorrow, I mean. He turned back, and she could see him weighing his words carefully. The investigation is going to continue for months, maybe years. There will be depositions, court appearances, probably multiple trials. We'll definitely see each other again in that context. That's not what I meant. Mason studied her face for a moment, then came back to stand beside the bed. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. What happened today, what we went through together, it creates a bond between people. But that bond isn't the same thing as a relationship. You've just escaped from an extremely controlling situation. You've just given birth. You're about to start a completely new life. The last thing you need is to jump into something complicated with someone who was essentially your rescuer. She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. I wasn't suggesting, I didn't mean. I know what you meant, Mason said gently, and I'm flattered, more than flattered. But I also know that what you're feeling right now is probably gratitude and relief, and the natural human response to trauma bonding. Those are powerful emotions, but they're not necessarily the foundation for something lasting. So what are you saying, that we can never be friends? That we have to pretend this didn't happen? I'm saying that we should take things one day at a time, focus on your recovery, on building a life for you, and faith on figuring out who you want to be now that you're free to choose. If there's something real between us, it'll still be there when you've had time to heal and grow and discover your own identity. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she knew the difference between gratitude and genuine caring, but the rational part of her mind recognized the wisdom in what he was saying. She had no experience with healthy relationships, no framework for understanding what was normal and what was trauma response. Maybe he was right to suggest caution. Will you at least stay in touch? Let me know how the investigation is going. Of course, Agent Monroe will be your primary contact, but I'll make sure you're kept informed about anything that affects you or Faith. After he left, Eleanor lay in the hospital bed listening to her daughter's soft breathing and watching the rain continue to fall outside the window. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone, not isolated or imprisoned, but genuinely free to think her own thoughts without fear of retribution or judgment. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She thought about the Hoffman family, about other families who might have disappeared over the years, about the children who were now in protective custody, trying to make sense of a world they'd been taught to fear. She thought about Mason and his guilt over promises he couldn't keep, about Agent Monroe and her commitment to seeking justice, about Dr. Chen and her matter-of-fact kindness. Most of all, she thought about Faith. Her daughter would grow up in a world where rain fell because of atmospheric pressure and temperature changes, not because of blood sacrifice. Where love was expressed through protection and nurturing, not through willingness to inflict or accept pain. Where faith meant hope and trust and personal connection to something greater, not blind obedience to the demands of a madman. Outside, thunder rumbled across the desert, and lightning illuminated the red rocks in brief, brilliant flashes. The storm was intensifying, washing away the dust and blood of the day's violence, preparing the earth for whatever would grow in its aftermath. Eleanor closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine a future she'd never dared to dream before. A small house somewhere safe, maybe near mountains or by a lake. Faith taking her first steps, saying her first words, asking endless questions about how the world worked. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings and lazy Sunday afternoons with nowhere to be but together. School concerts and scraped knees and homework battles. The proud terror of watching Faith learn to drive, then leave for college, then build her own life. with whatever dreams and goals and loves she chose for herself. It was a future that would require courage. Eleanor wasn't sure she possessed. Testifying against her father would mean reliving the worst moments of her life in front of strangers. Building a new identity would mean learning everything about the world that she'd been kept from understanding. Raising Faith would mean figuring out how to be a mother when her own childhood had been so fundamentally damaged. But as she drifted toward sleep, holding her daughter close and listening to the rain wash the desert clean, Eleanor felt something she'd never experienced before. Not just hope, but quiet confidence that she and Faith could build whatever kind of life they wanted. They were free now, free to make mistakes and learn from them, free to trust the wrong people and figure out how to trust the right ones, free to fail and try again and fail better next time, free to write their own story instead of living out someone else's prophecy. The rain continued to fall throughout the night, steady and soaking and completely natural. By morning, the desert would be transformed not by divine intervention or blood sacrifice, but by the simple, miraculous process of water returning to dry earth. And in a hospital room in Cedar City, a young woman slept peacefully with her newborn daughter, dreaming of a future where love didn't require sacrifice and faith didn't demand fear. Outside their window, the storm washed away the last traces of the society of divine light, preparing the ground for whatever would grow in the space it left behind. The morning sun streaming through the hospital window woke Eleanor before Faith's hungry cries could. For a moment she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, disoriented by the softness of clean sheets and the absence of the compound's morning prayer bells. Then Faith stirred against her chest, making the soft mewling sounds that meant feeding time, and reality crashed back over her like a wave. They were safe, they were free, and they were completely, utterly alone in a world Eleanor had never been allowed to understand. Dr. Chen appeared for the final examination just as Eleanor finished nursing Faith, her professional smile doing little to hide the concern in her eyes as she checked the healing mark on Eleanor's forehead. "The scarring should be minimal with proper care," she said, applying a fresh bandage. "But I want you to see a plastic surgeon within the week. The symbol was carved deep, and without intervention, it could leave a permanent reminder of what you've been through." "Maybe I should keep it," Eleanor said quietly, touching the bandage, "as a reminder of where I came from, what I survived." "That's entirely your choice," Dr. Chen replied carefully, "but I want you to make that decision when you've had time to heal both physically and emotionally. You don't have to carry visible scars of your trauma if you don't want to." Agent Monroe arrived just as the discharge paperwork was being completed, carrying a duffel bag that looked military in origin and wearing the same no-nonsense expression Eleanor remembered from the night before. "How are you feeling this morning?" she asked, setting the bag on the bed. "Like I'm about to walk off the edge of the world," Eleanor admitted, cradling Faith protectively. "I don't know anything about the outside world. I don't know how to rent an apartment or buy groceries or open a bank account. I don't even know what things cost." "That's what we're here for," Monroe replied, unzipping the duffel bag to reveal clothes, baby supplies, and what looked like official documents. "This is going to be a gradual process with lots of support along the way. You won't be thrown into the deep end and expected to swim." She pulled out a driver's license, social security card, and birth certificate, all bearing Eleanor's name, but issued by the state of Colorado rather than Utah. "New identity documents," she explained. "Clean records, no connection to the compound or your father's organization. Your new name is Ellen Winters, close enough to feel natural but different enough to provide some protection." "What about Faith?" Monroe handed her a tiny birth certificate printed on official paper. "Faith Ellen Winters, born yesterday at Cedar City Regional Medical Center. Father listed as unknown, which protects both of you from any legal complications down the road." Eleanor stared at the documents, trying to process what they meant. So I'm not Eleanor anymore. You can be whoever you want to be, Monroe said gently. The documents are just tools to help you build a new life. What name you use in your daily life, how you think of yourself, that's entirely up to you. The clothes in the bag were simple but well-chosen jeans. Sweaters, comfortable shoes in her size, all in colors that would help her blend in anywhere. There were also baby clothes for Faith, tiny outfits in soft pastels that made Eleanor's throat tight with emotion. At the compound, children wore whatever could be sewn from donated fabric, usually rough cotton in drab colors that wouldn't show dirt. The safe house is about 2 hours from here, Monroe continued as Eleanor changed into the new clothes. It's a small ranch outside Durango, Colorado, owned by a retired social worker named Margaret Chen, Dr. Chen's aunt, actually. She's housed other people in witness protection before, and she understands the kind of adjustment you're facing. Will I be able to leave to go places, within limits and with security protocols in place? The immediate threat is contained, but your father had connections. We're still mapping. Until we're certain there are no remaining risks, you'll need to stay in controlled environments. Faith began fussing as they prepared to leave the hospital, her tiny face scrunching up in preparation for a full-blown cry. Eleanor automatically began the rocking motion that seemed to calm her, but her own hands were shaking with anxiety about what came next. It's going to be overwhelming at first, Monroe said, noticing her distress. Everything will feel strange and foreign. That's normal. You've spent your entire life in one small, controlled environment. The outside world is going to seem impossibly big and complicated. What if I can't handle it? What if I'm not strong enough to make this work? Then you'll learn to be stronger, and you'll have help every step of the way. The drive to Colorado took them through landscape that was familiar, yet alien. The red rocks and desert scrub of southern Utah gradually gave way to the forested mountains of the Rockies. But instead of feeling liberated by the vastness, Eleanor found herself increasingly anxious. The world beyond the compound was enormous, filled with millions of people who knew things she didn't understood, references she wouldn't catch, had experiences she could never share. Faith slept peacefully in her car seat, for most of the journey occasionally stirring to make soft sounds that were already becoming familiar to Eleanor. Watching her daughter's serene face, she felt the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to run through the desert intensify. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced, Faith would have choices. She would know she was loved for who she was, not for what she could sacrifice for others. Margaret Chen's ranch appeared just as the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the pine trees. It was smaller than Mason's place, but there was something immediately welcoming about the neat garden, the well-maintained fence, and the smoke rising from the chimney. An older woman emerged from the house as their car pulled up, silver-haired, sturdy-looking, with the kind of calm competence that suggested years of dealing with difficult situations. "You must be Ellen," Margaret said, approaching with a warm smile that never wavered, despite the visible mark on Eleanor's forehead. "And this must be Faith. She's beautiful." The simple acceptance in Margaret's voice broke something loose in Eleanor's chest. She'd been bracing for questions, for judgment, for the kind of clinical assessment she'd received from government agents and medical professionals. Instead, she was being welcomed like a long-awaited house guest. "I've prepared the guest room for you," Margaret continued, leading them toward the house. "It connects to a smaller room that I've set up as a nursery. I wasn't sure what you'd need, so I probably went overboard with baby supplies." The interior of the house was everything the compound had not been: warm, comfortable, filled with books and soft furniture, and the kind of personal touches that spoke of a life lived fully. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, showing Margaret with various people who were clearly not blood relations, but had been claimed as family nonetheless. "Foster children," Margaret explained, noticing Eleanor's gaze. 43 over the years, plus a handful of adults who needed a safe place to restart their lives. You're not my first witness protection case. The guest room was perfect, spacious but not overwhelming, decorated in soothing blues and greens, with a comfortable rocking chair positioned near the window. The adjoining nursery made Eleanor gasp. There was a crib with a mobile of dancing butterflies, a changing table stocked with supplies, shelves lined with picture books, and a toy box that looked hand-painted. "Margaret, this is too much," she said, tears threatening. "I can't repay you for all this." "You're not supposed to repay me," Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "This is what people do for each other, what they should do for each other anyway." Agent Monroe left after ensuring that all security protocols were in place and communication systems were working. Before she went, she pressed a card into Eleanor's hand with her direct number. "Call me anytime," she said, "day or night for any reason. If you're scared, if you're confused, if you just need someone to talk to who understands what you've been through. I've worked with a lot of people transitioning out of controlling situations, and I promise you it gets easier." That first evening, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair with Faith in her arms, watching the sun set behind the mountains and trying to process the fact that she was free to do exactly this, nothing more complicated than holding her baby and watching the sky change colors. "Tell me about the compound," Margaret said gently from her position on the bed. "Not the traumatic parts if you're not ready, but what was daily life like for you?" "Structured," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "Every moment planned, every activity assigned. We woke to prayer bells at 5:30, ate the same breakfast every day, spent the morning in religious instruction, the afternoon in work assignments, the evening in community worship. No choices, no variations, no surprises. And now I can sit here for as long as I want doing nothing but holding my daughter. It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Margaret nodded with understanding. "Freedom can be overwhelming when you've never experienced it before. We'll start small, simple choices, basic experiences. You don't have to figure everything out at once." Over the next few days, Margaret proved to be an expert guide to the outside world. She started with the basics: how to work a television remote, how to use a cell phone, how to navigate a grocery store without having a panic attack at the overwhelming number of choices. 47 kinds of cereal. Eleanor marveled during their first shopping trip, staring at the breakfast aisle in amazement. "How do people choose? Trial and error mostly." Margaret laughed, and the knowledge that it's not a permanent decision. If you don't like the cereal you pick today, you can choose a different one next week. The concept of reversible decisions was revolutionary to someone who had spent her life believing that every choice carried eternal consequences. At the compound, questioning authority meant punishment. Expressing doubt meant re-education. Making the wrong decision could mean exile or worse. "You can change your mind," Margaret said gently, watching Eleanor struggle to choose between two brands of baby formula. "About anything, anytime. That's what freedom means: the right to be wrong, learn from it, and try again." Faith was thriving in their new environment, growing stronger and more alert each day. She seemed to respond to the calm atmosphere, sleeping peacefully and feeding well, her dark eyes beginning to focus on faces and follow movement. Watching her daughter discover the world was teaching Eleanor how to see it with fresh eyes as well. "She's never going to know fear the way you did," Margaret observed one evening as they watched Faith attempt to grasp the colorful mobile above her crib. "That's a gift. You're giving her the knowledge that love doesn't hurt, that safety is possible, that she has value beyond what she can do for others." It was during their second week at the ranch that Mason called. Eleanor's hands shook as she answered the phone, not sure what she wanted to hear from him or how she would feel about whatever news he brought. "How are you adjusting?" he asked, his voice warm but carefully professional. "It's harder than I expected," she admitted. Everything is so different, so overwhelming. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and think I'm still at the compound, that this is all a dream. That's normal. It takes time for your brain to accept that you're really safe. How's the investigation going? Mason's pause told her the news wasn't entirely good. We've made significant progress. The compound has been completely searched and we found evidence of criminal activities going back more than a decade. Financial records, weapons, caches, documentation of the families who joined the community over the years. What kind of documentation? Personal effects? Mostly. Items that should have been with people when they left, but were found stored in your father's private quarters. Wedding rings, family photos, children's toys. His voice grew grim, things that people wouldn't abandon willingly. Eleanor felt sick. How many families? We're still piecing it together, but at least 8 that we can confirm, maybe more. And my father refuses to cooperate, claims divine privilege, says he's only accountable to God, not to earthly authorities. His lawyers are arguing diminished capacity due to religious delusion. What does that mean for the case? It means the prosecution is going to need strong witness testimony to secure convictions. People who can speak to his state of mind, his methods of control, his willingness to use violence to maintain authority. The unspoken implication hung between them. Her testimony would be crucial. I don't know if I can do it, she said quietly. Stand up in court and talk about everything, with him sitting right there listening to every word. You don't have to decide anything now, Mason replied gently, but I want you to know that if you choose to testify, you won't be alone. There will be support, protection, preparation, and your voice could help bring justice for families like the Hoffmans. After the call ended, Eleanor sat in the darkening living room, holding faith and trying to imagine herself in a courtroom facing her father. The man who had raised her, shaped her worldview, carved symbols into her flesh, planned her death. Could she really find the courage to speak against him in front of strangers? Penny for your thoughts, Margaret said, settling into the chair opposite her. Mason wants me to testify against my father, to help convict him for the people he's hurt. And how do you feel about that? Terrified, Eleanor admitted, but also angry, not just for what he did to me and Faith, but for all those other families, all those children who trusted him to protect them, and instead... Anger can be a powerful motivator, Margaret said carefully, but it's not the only reason to seek justice. Sometimes we testify not because we're angry, but because we're strong enough to ensure that no one else has to suffer the way we did. Over the following weeks, as Eleanor grew more comfortable with the rhythms of normal life, the question of testimony continued to weigh on her mind. Agent Monroe called regularly with updates on the investigation, each conversation revealing new layers of Abraham's crimes and manipulation. We found a mass grave, Monroe said during one particularly difficult call, about 5 miles from the compound, hidden in a canyon. The remains are still being analyzed, but we believe some of them belong to the missing families. Eleanor had to sit down, her legs suddenly unable to support her. How many? At least 15 individuals, including children. Some of the remains are quite old, suggesting this has been going on for years. Oh God, I lived there. I was part of that place, and I never knew. You were a victim, Ellen. A child, then a young woman kept ignorant and isolated. You couldn't have known what you weren't allowed to see. But the guilt was crushing nonetheless. While she had been living her sheltered, controlled life at the compound, people had been dying in the desert. Families had been murdered and buried in unmarked graves, their disappearances explained away as divine interventions or the natural attrition of those who lacked sufficient faith. That night, she called Mason. I want to testify, she said without preamble. Whatever it takes, however hard it is, I want to help convict him. Are you sure once you commit to this, there's no going back? The defense will try to discredit you, to paint you as a disturbed young woman seeking revenge against her father. They'll dig into your mental health, your relationship with Abraham, every detail of your life at the compound." "Let them," she replied firmly. "I know what I lived through. I know what he's capable of. And I know that Faith deserves to grow up in a world where monsters like him are held accountable for their actions." The months that followed were intensive preparation for trial. Eleanor worked with prosecutors to organize her testimony, with therapists to process the trauma of reliving her experiences, with security specialists to ensure her safety as the trial approached. Faith grew and changed through it all, reaching the milestones that all babies reach, smiling, laughing, sitting up, reaching for toys. Each new development filled Eleanor with wonder and determination. This beautiful, innocent child would never know, the compound never be told, that her purpose was to serve others' twisted vision of divine will. "She's going to ask questions about her grandfather someday," Margaret said one evening as they watched Faith play with colorful blocks on the living room floor. "I know, I've thought about that. What will you tell her?" Eleanor picked up her daughter, marveling at how solid and real she felt, how completely present and alive. The truth, that sometimes people who should protect children hurt them instead, that her grandfather was sick in a way that made him dangerous, and that I made sure she would never have to be afraid of him. The call from Agent Monroe came on a gray February morning when Faith was 6 months old. Abraham had been found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide, with a note claiming that God had called him home to avoid the persecution of non-believers. "What does this mean for the case?" Eleanor asked, feeling strangely numb. "The charges against him die with him," Monroe replied. "But the cases against his surviving followers will continue. Your testimony will still be crucial for those prosecutions. And for me, what does it mean for me? It means your father can never hurt you again. It means you're truly free to build whatever life you want." That evening, Eleanor sat on the porch with Faith in her arms, watching snow fall on the mountains and trying to process what she felt about Abraham's death. There was relief, certainly, and a kind of closure she hadn't expected. But there was also sadness, not for the man who had planned to sacrifice her child, but for the father she had once believed loved her, the prophet she had once thought spoke for God. "He's really gone," she whispered to Faith, who was contentedly chewing on her own fingers. "He can never hurt us again." The trials of Abraham's surviving followers stretched through the spring and into summer. Eleanor testified in 3 separate proceedings, each time finding her voice a little stronger, her words a little clearer. The defense attorneys tried every tactic Mason had warned her about, but she held firm to her truth, speaking with quiet conviction about life at the compound and the culture of fear that had enabled so much suffering. The verdicts were mixed, some convictions, some acquittals, some plea bargains that felt insufficient, but were better than nothing. Justice, Eleanor learned, was more complicated and imperfect than she had hoped, but it was still justice. By Faith's first birthday, they had moved to a small house in Durango proper, close enough to Margaret for continued support, but independent enough to feel truly free. Eleanor had started taking classes at the local community college, working toward her GED, and eventually she hoped a degree in social work. "I want to help other people who are trying to escape from controlling situations," she told Margaret. "I want to use what I learned to make sure other children don't have to go through what those kids at the compound did." The birthday party was small, just Margaret, Agent Monroe, Dr. Chen, and her family, and a few neighbors who had become friends. Faith sat in her high chair, gleefully smashing cake with her tiny hands, while the adults laughed and took pictures. Mason had called that morning to wish Faith happy birthday and to let Eleanor know that the final trials had concluded. His voice was warm but still carefully professional, maintaining the boundaries he had established that first day in the hospital. "How are you doing, really?" he asked after they had discussed the legal outcomes. "Good," she replied, and realized she meant it. "Really good." Faith is walking. I'm getting A's in my classes, and I'm starting to understand who I am when I'm not defined by someone else's expectations. That's wonderful. I'm proud of you. Mason, yeah, thank you for everything, for saving us, for believing in us, for giving us the chance to become who we were supposed to be. There was a long pause before he replied. You saved yourselves, Ellen. I just provided a little help along the way. After the party, after the guests had gone home, and Faith was sleeping peacefully in her crib, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair that had moved with them from Margaret's ranch. The window looked out on a small garden she had planted herself, filled with vegetables and flowers that she had chosen simply because she liked them. Faith stirred in her sleep, making the soft sounds that meant she was dreaming. Whatever those dreams contained, they would be her own, not shaped by someone else's prophecies or twisted by someone else's interpretation of divine will. Tomorrow there would be classes, to attend papers, to write a future, to build one day at a time. There would be challenges and setbacks, moments of doubt and periods of struggle. But there would also be choices, endless, wonderful, reversible choices about everything, from breakfast cereal to career paths, to the kind of person she wanted to become. Outside, the Colorado night was clear and star-filled, vast with possibility. Somewhere in that darkness, other people were probably escaping from their own compounds, their own controlling families, their own versions of Abraham Winters. Some of them would find their way to safety, to people like Margaret and Mason and Agent Monroe, who understood that everyone deserved the chance to write their own story. Eleanor touched the barely visible scar on her forehead where the mark of the chosen had once branded her as property. She had decided to keep the scar, after all, not as a reminder of trauma, but as proof of survival. She had been marked for sacrifice and had chosen life instead, had been told her purpose was to die and had decided to live instead. In her crib, Faith slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams belong to children who have always been free, always been safe, always been loved, simply for existing. She would grow up knowing that Rhone fell because of atmospheric conditions, not blood sacrifice. That love was expressed through protection and nurturing, not through willingness to inflict or accept pain. She would grow up free to become whoever she wanted to be, and that Eleanor thought as she watched her daughter sleep was the most powerful prophecy of all. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years after Faith's first birthday, when the maple trees outside Eleanor's kitchen window were blazing with autumn fire. She had been helping Faith practice writing her name, something the 4-year-old approached with the same determined concentration she brought to everything else, when the phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Ellen Winters. The voice was unfamiliar, professional, but warm. This is Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the Colorado Department of Human Services. I hope you don't mind me calling. Eleanor's first instinct was panic. Years of conditioning made any unexpected contact from government agencies feel like a threat. But Faith looked up from her paper with bright, curious eyes, and the normalcy of their morning routine helped ground her in the present. How can I help you, Dr. Martinez? I'm calling because we have a situation that we think you might be uniquely qualified to address. Are you familiar with the group called the Eternal Light Fellowship? The name sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. No, but it sounds like the kind of organization my father would have approved of. Unfortunately, you're probably right. It's a religious community in western Colorado that's been operating under the radar for about 15 years. Yesterday, a 17-year-old girl named Sarah escaped from their compound. She's pregnant, traumatized, and absolutely terrified that they're going to find her and bring her back. Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she was reminded that the Society of Divine Light hadn't been unique, that there were other Abraham Winters figures out there, other children being raised to believe their lives belong to someone else's twisted interpretation of divine will. What does this have to do with me? Sarah specifically asked to speak with someone who had been through something similar. She heard about your case during the trials. Apparently it was covered in some of the alternative media sources that these groups monitor. She said she needed to talk to someone who would understand what it felt like to run. Faith had abandoned her writing practice and was now listening intently to the one-sided conversation, her small face serious in the way it got when she sensed something important was happening. At 4, she was already remarkably perceptive, able to read emotional undercurrents that many adults missed. "Where is she now?" Eleanor asked. "Safe house in Grand Junction. But she's not eating, barely sleeping, and she keeps asking when they're going to come for her. The counselors we've assigned are good, but they don't have personal experience with this kind of situation. Sarah needs to hear from someone who survived what she's going through." "I'll come," Eleanor said without hesitation. "When do you need me there? Are you sure? I know this might bring up difficult memories for you." Eleanor looked at Faith, who was now coloring with intense concentration, her tongue sticking out slightly in the way it did when she was completely absorbed in a task. Her daughter was healthy, happy, secure in the knowledge that she was loved unconditionally. She would never doubt her own worth, never be told that her purpose was to serve others at the expense of her own life. "Dr. Martinez, 3 years ago, someone took a chance on me when I was terrified and alone and convinced I was going to die in the desert. If I can help this girl feel even a little bit less afraid, then yes, I'm absolutely sure." The drive to Grand Junction took 3 hours, winding through mountain passes that were just beginning to show the first dusting of early snow. Margaret had insisted on coming along, both to provide support and to watch Faith, who chattered excitedly about the adventure of visiting a new place. "Mama, why is the girl scared?" Faith asked as they drove through a particularly stunning stretch of aspens, turned golden by the season. It was a question Eleanor had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. How did you explain to a 4-year-old that some adults hurt children? How did you maintain a child's sense of safety while acknowledging that the world could be dangerous? Sometimes, sweetheart, there are grown-ups who teach children that they have to do things that aren't good for them. They make the children believe that they don't have choices about their own lives. Like when Tommy's dad makes him eat vegetables he doesn't like. Margaret smiled from the driver's seat. Faith's frame of reference for authority and control was so beautifully normal. Bedtimes, vegetables, sharing toys, the kind of minor power struggles that healthy families navigated with love and patience. "Sort of like that, but much more serious," Eleanor said carefully. "This girl was taught that she had to give up her baby to make her family happy, but that's not true, and now she's learning that she can make her own choices. Like how I get to choose my own clothes." Exactly like that. Everyone should get to make choices about their own life. The safe house was an unremarkable ranch-style building in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place that was designed to blend in and attract no attention. Dr. Martinez met them at the door, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of calm competence that came from years of dealing with traumatic situations. "Thank you for coming," she said, shaking Eleanor's hand. "Sarah's been asking about you every hour since I called. She's in rough shape." They were led to a small living room where a teenage girl sat curled in the corner of a couch, her arms wrapped around her knees and her dark hair hanging like a curtain around her face. She was visibly pregnant, probably about 7 months along, and so thin that it was clear she hadn't been eating well for some time. "Sarah," Dr. Martinez said gently, "this is Ellen, the woman I told you about." The girl looked up, and Eleanor saw her own past reflected in those frightened eyes. Sarah had the same haunted look, the same hypervigilance, the same bone-deep exhaustion that came from years of living under someone else's absolute control. "You really escaped?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really did," Eleanor replied, settling into a chair across from her. 3.5 years ago, I was about as pregnant as you are now and just as scared. They said you were the daughter of a prophet, that your father was chosen by God to interpret his will. That's what I was told my entire life. It wasn't true." Sarah's eyes widened. "But the prophecies, the signs, the way everything lined up exactly like the elders said it would." "Let me ask you something," Eleanor said gently. "How many prophecies didn't come true? How many signs were ignored or explained away when they didn't fit the narrative? How many times did the leaders change their interpretation when reality didn't match their predictions?" The question seemed to hit Sarah like a physical blow. She uncurled slightly, her hands going protectively to her belly. "They said the baby had to be given back to God," she whispered, "that it was the only way to ensure the community's salvation, that I was selfish for wanting to keep it." "Who told you that?" "Elder Marcus. He said God had revealed to him that my baby was meant to be a sacrifice like Isaac in the Bible. That if I truly loved God and the community, I would be willing to give up what I loved most." Eleanor felt sick. Different names, different faces, but the same twisted logic that had nearly cost Faith her life. "Sarah, can I tell you something that took me years to understand?" The girl nodded, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "People who use God as an excuse to hurt children aren't speaking for God. They're speaking for themselves, for their own need to control and manipulate others. Real love, the kind of love that actually comes from something divine, doesn't ask you to sacrifice your child's life. It asks you to protect it." "But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm being selfish and the community suffers because I wouldn't do what God wanted? Then the community isn't worthy of protection," Eleanor said firmly. "Any group that would demand the death of an innocent baby to ensure their own salvation isn't a community of faith. It's a cult built on fear and control." She pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a picture of Faith from the previous weekend, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while covered in finger paint from an art project. "This is my daughter, the one I was supposed to sacrifice to bring rain to the desert. She's 4 years old now, healthy and happy, and completely free to become whoever she wants to be. And you know what? It rained anyway. Not because of blood sacrifice, but because that's what rain does. It falls when atmospheric conditions are right, not when human beings spill blood to appease an angry God." Sarah stared at the photo with something approaching wonder. "She's beautiful." "She is, and so will your baby be. Not because it's destined for sacrifice, but because it's going to be loved and protected and given every opportunity to live its own life." Over the next 2 hours, Eleanor shared her story: the escape, the birth in the storm cellar, the long process of learning to live in the outside world. She talked about the fear and confusion, but also about the joy of making choices, the wonder of watching Faith discover the world, the deep satisfaction that came from building a life based on love rather than control. "It's hard," she admitted, "harder than they tell you it will be. There are days when the outside world feels overwhelming, when you question every decision, when part of you wants to go back to the simplicity of having someone else make all your choices. But then you remember what that simplicity cost, and you find the strength to keep moving forward." "What about your father?" Sarah asked. "Do you ever miss him?" The question cut deep, touching on grief that Eleanor was still processing years after Abraham's death. "I miss the father I thought he was when I was little. The man who told me stories and held me when I had nightmares. But that person either never existed or got lost somewhere along the way. The man who carved symbols into my forehead and planned to kill my baby wasn't my father. He was someone who had been consumed by his own need for power and control." Sarah was quiet for a long time, one hand absently stroking her belly, while she processed what she'd heard. Finally, she looked up with something that might have been hope flickering in her eyes. "Will you stay with me tonight? I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't want to be alone." "Of course." That evening, after Faith had been settled in a nearby hotel room with Margaret, Eleanor sat with Sarah as the girl ate her first real meal in days. They talked about practical things, prenatal care, labor, and delivery, what it was like to hold your baby for the first time. But underneath the practical discussions was the deeper work of helping Sarah believe that she deserved to make her own choices about her life and her child's future. "I keep expecting them to find me," Sarah said as they prepared for bed. "Every car that drives by, every phone call, every knock at the door, I think it's them coming to take me back." "That feeling fades," Eleanor assured her. "Slowly, but it fades. One day you'll realize that you went an entire week without looking over your shoulder, then a month. Then you'll understand that you're truly free. What if I'm not strong enough to be a good mother? What if I make mistakes?" All mothers make mistakes. The difference is that you'll make them out of love, not out of some twisted sense of duty to a cause that values ideology over human life. Your baby will be better off with an imperfect mother who loves them unconditionally than with a perfect martyr who thinks their highest purpose is to die. Sarah's labor began 2 weeks later on a snowy November morning when the mountains were white with fresh powder. Eleanor was in her social work classes when Margaret called to say that Sarah had asked for her to be present for the birth. The drive to the hospital felt like déjà vu, but instead of running from danger, they were rushing toward a moment of joy and new beginning. Sarah's labor was long but uncomplicated, and when her son finally arrived, red-faced and squalling with indignation at the cold world, she looked at him with the same fierce protectiveness that Eleanor remembered feeling when Faith was born. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, echoing words Eleanor had spoken in a storm cellar 3.5 years earlier. "I'm your mama, and I'm never going to let anyone hurt you." She named him David after the biblical king who had defeated giants with nothing but faith and a slingshot, because she explained to Eleanor, he's going to grow up knowing that sometimes the smallest person in the room is the one who changes everything. The Eternal Light Fellowship was raided 6 months later following an investigation that Sarah's testimony had made possible. Unlike Abraham's followers, most of Marcus's people surrendered without violence when faced with federal agents. The compound yielded evidence of financial crimes and child abuse, but no mass graves apparently. Marcus had been more interested in control and money than in blood sacrifice. "Different methods, same goal," Agent Monroe explained during one of her regular check-in calls. "These groups all follow similar patterns. They isolate their followers, create artificial scarcity, and fear, then present themselves as the only solution to problems they've largely created." Sarah chose to stay in Colorado after her testimony was complete, enrolling in a program for young mothers while she worked toward her high school diploma. She and David became regular visitors to Eleanor's house, creating an extended family of choice that grew stronger with each passing season. "He's going to ask about his grandfather someday," Sarah said one afternoon as they watched David and Faith play in the backyard. At 18 months, David was walking steadily, but still preferred crawling when he wanted to move fast, while 5-year-old Faith appointed herself his patient teacher and protector. "What will you tell him? The truth when he's old enough to understand it. That sometimes people who should protect children hurt them instead. That his grandfather was sick in a way that made him dangerous. And that I made sure David would never have to be afraid of him." The words were nearly identical to ones Eleanor had spoken to Margaret years earlier, and hearing them from Sarah's lips drove home how these patterns of trauma and recovery echoed across generations, across families, across time. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing enough?" Sarah asked. "If there are other girls out there, other children who need help but don't know how to ask for it?" The question had been weighing on Eleanor's mind as well. Her social work studies had shown her the scope of the problem. Thousands of children in controlling religious environments, isolated communities, where abuse was disguised as discipline and exploitation was justified as spiritual growth. The Society of Divine Light and the Eternal Light Fellowship were just 2 examples of a much larger phenomenon. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, Eleanor replied, about what we could do to reach kids who are still trapped in situations like we were. What did you have in mind? A foundation, maybe, or a non-profit organization, something that could provide resources for people trying to escape controlling groups and education for the general public about how these groups operate. Sarah's eyes lit up. Like a network of safe houses, people who understand what it's like to run. Exactly. People who know that when someone shows up pregnant and terrified with symbols carved in their forehead, you don't call the police, you offer them soup and a place to sleep. The idea took shape over the following months, growing from late-night conversations into a concrete plan. Eleanor's social work program included courses in nonprofit management and grant writing skills she threw herself into with the intensity of someone who had found her calling. Sarah contributed research and personal testimony, while Margaret provided wisdom from decades of fostering and witness protection work. Mason, when Eleanor finally called to tell him about the project, was immediately supportive. "There's definitely a need for this kind of work," he said. "The Bureau has contacts with dozens of groups operating across the Southwest alone. Most of them are small family-based operations, but they all follow similar patterns of control and isolation. Would the FBI be willing to work with us, provide referrals, consultation, that kind of thing? Officially, probably not directly, but informally, I think there are a lot of agents who would be very interested in having a resource for people who escape from these situations." The Faith and Hope Foundation was officially incorporated on the 4th anniversary of Faith's birth, with Eleanor as executive director and Sarah as program coordinator. Their first safe house was Margaret's Ranch, expanded and improved to accommodate multiple families. Their second was a small apartment building in Denver that they purchased with a combination of grant money and private donations. "We're really doing this," Sarah said, as they stood in the empty lobby of the Denver facility, holding architectural plans and paint samples, while David and Faith ran around the echoing space, their laughter bouncing off bare walls. "We're really doing this," Eleanor agreed, feeling the same combination of terror and exhilaration that had marked every major transition in her post-compound life. The first family arrived 3 weeks later, a mother and 3 children who had escaped from a polygamist community in Arizona. The woman, Maria, was barely older than Eleanor had been when Faith was born, but she carried herself with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had been fighting for survival far longer than anyone should have to. "They said I was being selfish," Maria explained during their initial intake interview, her youngest child, a 2-year-old girl, clinging to her leg, while her older children sat silent and watchful. "That wanting to keep my children together instead of letting the elders redistribute them was putting my own desires above the good of the community." "You weren't being selfish," Eleanor said firmly. "You were being a mother. That's what mothers do. They protect their children even when other people try to convince them that protection is selfishness." Over the next 6 months, Maria and her children slowly adjusted to life outside their insular community. The kids enrolled in public school for the first time, discovering playgrounds and art classes, and the revolutionary concept that they were allowed to ask questions without fear of punishment. Maria worked toward her GED while learning to navigate grocery stores, bank accounts, and all the other mundane complexities of independent adult life. "It's overwhelming sometimes," Maria admitted during one of their regular counseling sessions. "Everything is so big and complicated out here. Sometimes I think about how simple life was when someone else made all the decisions." "That's normal," Eleanor replied, remembering her own moments of doubt and confusion. "Freedom is messier than control, but it's also more honest. When you make mistakes out here, they're your mistakes to learn from. When you succeed, it's your success to celebrate." The foundation grew steadily, adding staff, facilities, and programs, As word spread through networks of social workers, law enforcement, and advocacy groups, they developed protocols for emergency extractions, long-term housing educational support, job training, and family reunification. Most importantly, they created a community of survivors who understood each other's experiences in ways that no amount of professional training could provide. Faith, now 6 and starting first grade, took her role as unofficial ambassador to traumatized children seriously. She had an intuitive understanding of how to approach kids who flinched at sudden movements or unexpected sounds, offering friendship without overwhelming them with attention. "Why don't they like loud noises?" she asked one evening after playing quietly with twins who had recently arrived from a group that believed children should be seen but not heard. "They're not used to it being safe to make noise," Eleanor explained. "Where they came from, being loud could get you in trouble. It's going to take time for them to learn that they're allowed to play and laugh and be as loud as they want. Like how it took David time to learn that he could ask for food when he was hungry." "Exactly like that." Faith nodded solemnly, already planning quieter games for the next day's playdate. Her childhood was shaped by these encounters with other children's trauma, but instead of making her fearful or anxious, the experiences seemed to deepen her natural empathy and strengthen her sense of security in her own safe world. The call from Mason came on a warm June evening when Faith was 7, as Eleanor was helping her practice reading from a chapter book about a girl who discovered she could talk to animals. "I have someone I'd like you to meet," he said without preamble. "A 15-year-old boy who walked out of a survivalist compound in Montana 3 days ago. He's asking for you specifically." "Me? How does he even know who I am?" "Apparently your story has become something of a legend in these communities. Kids pass it around like an underground railroad map, proof that escape is possible, that there's help waiting on the outside." Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. She'd become inadvertently famous in the exact demographic she least wanted to be known, by a symbol of defiance in communities built on absolute obedience. "Is he safe?" "For now, but he says there are others who want to leave but are too scared to try. He's hoping you might consider visiting the area, maybe setting up some kind of outreach program." "Montana's a long way from Colorado." "I know, and I know it would mean stepping back into territory that might feel uncomfortably familiar. But this kid, his name is Peter, he says there are at least a dozen families in his community who are having doubts about the leadership. Women with children who want out but don't know how to make it happen." Eleanor looked at Faith, who was sounding out words with determined concentration, her tongue poking out slightly in the way it did when she was working hard. In 2 months, Faith would start 2nd grade. She could read chapter books, ride a bicycle, and had recently announced her intention to become either a veterinarian or a dragon trainer when she grew up. She was everything Eleanor had never been allowed to be at her age: confident, curious, secure in the knowledge that her life belonged to her and her alone. "I'll go," she said finally, "but I want Sarah with me, and I want FBI support in case things go sideways." Already arranged. The trip to Montana felt like traveling backward through time. The landscape was beautiful but harsh, the kind of country that attracted people who wanted to live apart from mainstream society. Peter met them at a truck stop outside Missoula, a thin, serious boy with prematurely adult eyes and the careful way of moving that suggested years of trying not to draw attention to himself. "You really did it," he said to Eleanor, studying her face as if looking for proof of some kind. "You really got away and built a normal life." "I did. And so can you." "What about the others? The families who are too scared to leave but want to?" "That's why we're here, to let them know they have options." Over the next week, working with local law enforcement and social services, they established a temporary outreach center in a community center in town. Word spread through unofficial channels, the network of doubt and whispered questions that existed in every controlling community, no matter how isolated or committed to their ideology. They came in twos and threes, mostly women with children, some accompanied by husbands who looked torn between protective instinct and ingrained obedience to community leadership. Each family carried the same burden of fear and uncertainty that Eleanor remembered so clearly, the agonizing weight of choosing between the familiar horror of control and the unknown terror of freedom. "My daughter is 12, one woman said during a private consultation, her voice barely audible. "They're already talking about finding her a husband among the leadership. They say it's an honor, but she's just a baby. She still plays with dolls." "Then get her out," Eleanor replied. "Whatever it takes, whatever you have to leave behind, get her out before they steal her childhood completely." "But what about my other children? My husband, the community is all we've ever known." "The community will survive without you. Your children might not survive with it." By the end of the week, 7 families had made the decision to leave. The extraction was coordinated like a military operation, with federal agents, social workers, and foundation staff working together to move 23 people, including 12 children, to safety in a single night. The compound leadership's response was swift and predictable. They declared the departed families to be under divine judgment, claimed that disasters would befall the region as punishment for their faithlessness, and tightened control over the remaining members to prevent further defections. But the seed had been planted. Over the following months, individual families continued to make contact, asking for help, for resources, for proof that life was possible outside the walls they'd been taught to never cross. "We're making a difference," Sarah said one evening as they reviewed the Foundation's quarterly report. In 3 years, they had helped more than 200 people transition out of controlling religious groups with a success rate that exceeded anything in the academic literature. "Are we, though?" Eleanor asked, feeling the weight of all the children they hadn't been able to reach, all the families still trapped in communities built on fear and control. "Sometimes I feel like we're just putting band-aids on a massive wound." "Every person we help is someone's entire world," Sarah replied firmly. "Every child who grows up free instead of controlled is a victory. Every mother who gets to raise her children according to her own values instead of someone else's twisted interpretation of divine will, that matters." Faith chose that moment to wander into the kitchen in her pajamas, claiming she needed water but clearly hoping to extend bedtime through strategic lingering. "What are you talking about?" she asked, climbing into Eleanor's lap with the casual confidence of a child who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. "We're talking about how to help more children like the ones who come to stay with us sometimes. The scared ones." "Yes, sweetheart, the scared ones." Faith was quiet for a moment, leaning against her mother's chest and thinking with the serious concentration she brought to important questions. "Maybe," she said finally, "instead of waiting for them to find us, we should find them first. Like when you're playing hide and seek and you know someone's hiding, but they're too scared to come out on their own." The simplicity of the observation was stunning. Instead of waiting for people to escape and then helping them rebuild, what if they could reach people before the crisis point? What if they could plant seeds of doubt, provide resources for gradual transition, create pathways out that didn't require the kind of desperate flight that had nearly killed both Eleanor and Sarah? "That's a very smart idea," Eleanor said, pressing a kiss to the top of Faith's head. "What made you think of it?" "Because that's what you did for me," Faith replied matter-of-factly. "You found me before the scary people could hurt me, and you made sure I never had to be afraid." The words hit Eleanor like a revelation. She had spent years thinking about her own story as an escape, a flight from danger. But Faith was right. It had also been a rescue, a choice to prioritize love over ideology, protection over prophecy. And if she could make that choice for one child, she could help other parents make the same choice for theirs. The Faith and Hope Foundation's prevention program launched the following spring with a focus on education, outreach, and early intervention. Instead of waiting for crisis situations, they began working with mainstream religious communities to identify warning signs of extremism and provide resources for families who were being pressured to make dangerous choices in the name of faith. "We're not anti-religion," Eleanor explained during a presentation to a conference of social workers. "We're pro-child welfare. We're pro-family preservation. We're pro-choice in the most fundamental sense. The choice of every human being to determine their own relationship with the divine, their own understanding of love, their own definition of family." The work was harder and more subtle than crisis intervention, requiring patience, cultural sensitivity, and a deep understanding of how beliefs evolved and changed over time. But it was also more hopeful, catching families before they reached the point of desperation that made escape feel like the only option. Faith, now 8 and increasingly aware of the Foundation's work, had her own ideas about prevention. "You should make a book," she announced one morning over breakfast. "Like the books about stranger danger, but about grown-ups who say mean things about God." "What kind of book?" "One that teaches kids that if grown-ups say God wants them to be hurt or scared, those grown-ups are lying. And that real love, the God kind of love, makes you feel safe, not scared." The children's book project became a family endeavor with Faith contributing ideas and illustrations, while Eleanor worked with child psychologists and religious scholars to craft age-appropriate messages about healthy spirituality versus dangerous extremism. The resulting book, God's Love Feels Safe, became a bestseller in educational and therapeutic circles, translated into 12 languages and distributed to schools, libraries, and social service agencies across the globe. "Look, Mama," Faith said one evening, showing her a letter from a teacher in Germany. "This lady says our book helped her student understand that her uncle wasn't speaking for God when he said scary things to her. How does that make you feel?" "Important," Faith replied seriously. "Like maybe I can help other kids the way you helped me." On Faith's 10th birthday, they celebrated not just another year of her life, but the Foundation's 5th anniversary and the publication of their first academic study on successful intervention strategies for religious extremism. The party was held at the original safe house, Margaret's Ranch, now expanded to include dormitories, classrooms, and therapy offices, with guests including dozens of families whose lives had been touched by their work. Mason attended, as he had every year, bringing news from the law enforcement side of their shared mission and maintaining the careful professional friendship that had evolved from their initial trauma bond. "Any regrets?" he asked as they watched Faith and her friends play an elaborate game that seemed to involve dragons, princesses, and social justice. "About what?" "About not taking the easy path. You could have disappeared into witness protection, changed your name, completely raised Faith in anonymity. Instead, you chose to stay visible to help other people, to build something bigger than your own safety." Eleanor considered the question seriously, watching Faith mediate a dispute between two younger children with the kind of natural wisdom that came from growing up surrounded by stories of conflict and resolution. "Sometimes I wonder what our life would have been like if we'd just vanished," she admitted. "If Faith had grown up completely normal without knowing about the Foundation or the work we do, but then I see letters from kids like that little girl in Germany, or I meet families who found hope when they thought there was none, and I know we made the right choice. Even with the risk, the visibility makes you a target for other extremist groups. Everything worthwhile involves risk. Faith knows that the work we do is important, but also potentially dangerous. She knows there are people who disagree with our message, who think we're interfering with their religious freedom, but she also knows that protecting children is worth those risks." As if summoned by their conversation, Faith appeared at Eleanor's elbow, grass-stained and breathless from play, but glowing with happiness. "Mama, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if you'll tell the story about the rain." It had become tradition at Foundation events The story of Faith's birth during the storm that ended the 7-year drought, told as a reminder that miracles came from love and courage, not from sacrifice and fear. Of course, sweetheart. As Eleanor gathered the mixed crowd of children and adults around her, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility and privilege that came with being a keeper of stories. Some of the children listening had lived through their own versions of what she was about to describe. Others, like Faith, had been protected from that experience but needed to understand it to make sense of the world they were inheriting. Once upon a time, she began, there was a young woman who was told that her baby had to die to make the rain come. But she loved her baby more than she feared the drought, and she ran through the desert to find someone who would help her choose love over fear. The story unfolded as it always did, with interruptions and questions, and the kind of engaged listening that came from an audience who understood that stories weren't just entertainment, but tools for making sense of experience. And when the baby was born, Faith chimed in from her place in the circle, having heard the story hundreds of times, but never tiring of its familiar cadences. It rained, not because of magic or sacrifice, but because that's what rain does. It comes when it's time, whether people are ready or not. That's right, Eleanor agreed, smiling at her daughter's addition to the narrative. And the little girl grew up knowing that love doesn't require sacrifice, that faith doesn't require fear, and that every person gets to choose their own relationship with the divine. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that only appeared in the high desert, the assembled families began the slow process of saying goodbye and returning to their various homes and safe houses and new beginnings. Sarah lingered as she always did, helping with cleanup, while David and Faith continued their eternal game of tag around the ranch buildings. Do you ever think about what your father would say if he could see all this? Sarah asked, gesturing toward the bustling scene of families packing up after a day of celebration. Honestly, I think he'd be furious, Eleanor replied. All these children growing up free to question authority, to make their own choices, to believe that their lives belong to them rather than to some higher cause. It would represent everything he fought against. And how does that make you feel? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching Faith help a smaller child tie her shoes with the patient kindness that had become her trademark. Proud, she said finally. Proud that we built something he would hate, because that means we built something that puts children's welfare above adults' need for control. Proud that Faith is growing up to be everything he tried to prevent, independent questioning, confident in her own worth. She's going to change the world, that kid. She already has. Every day she shows other children that it's possible to be both faithful and free, both respectful and independent. She's proof that you can honor the divine without sacrificing your humanity. As they loaded the last of the cleanup supplies into cars, Faith ran over to throw her arms around both women in one of her trademark group hugs. This was the best birthday ever, she announced, with the kind of absolute conviction that only children could muster. Even better than last year, Eleanor teased, remembering Faith's declaration 12 months earlier that turning 9 was the most important thing that had ever happened to her. Even better, because now I'm double digits, and double-digit people get to help with the really important work. What kind of really important work did you have in mind? Faith's expression grew serious, taking on the thoughtful look that meant she was about to share an idea she'd been developing for some time. I want to start a club at school for kids who have questions about religion but are afraid to ask them, like a safe place where you can say you don't understand something without getting in trouble. The simplicity and wisdom of the proposal took Eleanor's breath away. 10 years old, and Faith had already identified one of the key mechanisms by which extremist groups maintained control: the prohibition against questions, the equation of doubt with disloyalty. I think that's a wonderful idea, she said. What would you call this club? Faith grinned, the expression lighting up her entire face. The Rainbow Club. because after storms there are always rainbows. And rainbows are made of lots of different colors, but they're still all part of the same beautiful thing. As they drove home through the mountain darkness, Faith chattering excitedly about her plans for the Rainbow Club, and Sarah adding practical suggestions about adult supervision and parental permissions. Eleanor felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Ahead of them, the lights of town twinkled like earthbound stars, marking the homes and lives of hundreds of families who had found their own ways to balance faith and freedom, tradition and independence, community and individual choice. Behind them, the ranch grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the work it represented continued to expand, reaching families and children across the country and around the world. And beside her, Faith hummed quietly to herself, already planning how to make the world a little safer for children who had questions, a little more welcoming for families who needed help, a little more understanding for people who had been taught that love required sacrifice. At 10 years old, Faith Winters was everything the prophecy had never intended her to be, not a sacrifice to someone else's vision of salvation, but a living testament to the power of love over fear, choice over control, hope over despair. The rain that had fallen on the night of her birth had indeed brought new life to the desert, but it wasn't the kind of life Abraham Winters had envisioned in his twisted prophecies. It was better, more complicated, more beautiful, and infinitely more free. And it was just the beginning.